who are these people and why are they in charge?
Whew, man, that's a hot one. Let's see.
All yours now.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. And again, I've seen these people up close.
How? They don't live in your neighborhood. They would have to drive like 40 miles to find you because, like that's the crazy thing. It's like, and they're speaking for you. Alyssa Milano is your spokesperson now.
No, you know
Good
what?
luck.
No, here's here's the thing about that. I think I know what you're talking about. You're talking about people who actually may be coming from a very good place, but the way to approach people is very condescending and is very patronizing. And they feel like that the way to help you is to come in and swoop in like Superman and tell you that I'm here to help you without really engaging with you until asking you or even asking you who you are, first of all, and asking you what you want. And these are also the people who have access to media. They are able to make the connections to get themselves on CNN and portray themselves as the savior of everybody else. They are often, a lot of times, more detrimental to the people they claim to help than the people who are active enemies because they don't listen. And because they're so caught up in their own self-image that they don't really want to help anybody outside of themselves. I think that's very dangerous. It's like the people who are going to help you to death. You know what I mean?
That's right. Welcome to an all-new episode of the McFuture podcast. I'm Steve Faktor, and today I have a very special guest, Torraine Walker. Torraine is a journalist, an entrepreneur, and an activist. He's both a supporter and a critic of the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the things that are happening today. He and I had a spectacular conversation, completely open and candid, and we didn't always agree, but I hope it serves at least as a small example of how people who don't necessarily see things the same way can engage with each other in a meaningful, substantive way. Anyway, I think it was a great conversation and I think you'll enjoy it. And if you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe, review it on iTunes, and join the Patreon where I'll have bonus material and many other exclusives. Let's jump right in. Torraine, first of all, welcome. Thank you for coming on the show. Really excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me on, Steve. I appreciate it.
Who is the real Torraine Walker? Just give us a little bit of a background.
Well, I was born in Florida, Jacksonville. From there, I moved to Atlanta right after school because this is where the quote unquote Black Mecca was. This is where the opportunities were. This is where, all the Black enterprising was going on. I worked in corporate for about the better part of a decade, but I always had a bug to get into journalism and writing. I've been writing since I was 3 or 4 years old. And I started blogging around 2014. And right about the time I started blogging was when Trayvon Martin was killed, a couple of years after that. So I was just basically blogging my feelings about that as an African-American man. And then right after that happened, Mike Brown happened. And right after Mike Brown happened, there was like this succession of police killings of Black males. So I started writing about that. And I ended up getting reached out to by the Huffington Post. So I ended up becoming a regular writer for the Huffington Post. I did that for about 1.5 years. And then I moved into freelancing for a lot of different major magazines. I have like 50, 60 bylines, I think. And I started realizing that while my profile was starting to grow in mainstream media, a lot of what I wanted to say was getting filtered through editors and through people and basically gatekeepers who wanted to take the things I wanted to say and really doctor them in ways that didn't really fit my message. So at the time that was happening, I started realizing that social media was becoming a major player in how you could get a message across. So I said, why don't I just start taking my images, taking the things I feel, talking to people I want to talk to, and building my own thing. So I built Context Media that way. So now I own that.
What would be something that an editor might try to coax or massage in terms of your message?
Well, when you're talking about a very high profile and high attention grabbing subject, especially something that's going to like rub people one way or another, that's going to be very polarizing, there tends to be this idea in mainstream media that you have to massage the feelings of the majority of your readers. And I dealt with a lot of that, dealing with editors who wanted to take out certain language, or they wanted to have certain people who I maybe interviewed not really speak and try to look around for somebody who might be a little bit more mellow. And I was like, if you really want to get to the core of why people are reacting to things the way they are, you have to bring in everybody's language. You have to, I understand you have to clean certain things up for publication, but you have to get to the core of why people are moving the way they are. And there was a lot of pushback against that. And at some risk to my financial health and to my career, I said, no, I don't want to do that. These people deserve a right to speak, so I'm going to do that. So that's in a nutshell what I had to deal with.
Were these incidents sort of the motivating force for you to even put out the content, or were you feeling certain things before and then this brought it out? Was there a change that happened in you, and what was that change in terms of your emotional state, how you think about the world, how you think about justice, and so on?
No, I wouldn't say there was really anything that affected my emotional state or that I had like an epiphany about how I was moving. I exist in this country in the skin that I exist in. So I've always been aware of certain injustices that happen in this country. I think what happened was, I think what changed everything was the advent of social media and the fact that we almost had like live, for lack of a better term, live streaming events of these things that were happening. So I think it was that so much, it wasn't so much that anything happened to my awareness. I think the world and I think the rest of the country got an awareness, and that lined up with the fact that media was moving off of newspapers and off of hard media into like social media spaces. So it was just sort of like a synergy that happened with people wanting this content, meaning being made aware of this content, and people like myself who were placed to talk about this content. I think that's really what it was.
Are there things in your own personal life and personal history that are especially relevant to what's happening? Are there things that experiences you've had, times where you felt there are injustices, where you kind of especially connected with some of the events that have been happening?
Yeah, I've had the experience of, having to be aware of what neighborhood you're in sometimes because there's a possibility that you might get stopped just because you look like you look in a neighborhood that people say you're not supposed to be in. I've had situations where I've been stopped in cars and pulled over, and it hasn't gone the way I wanted it to go as far as like from a respect standpoint. Fortunately, I haven't really been had to deal with any kind of hard physical abuse, but I have been stopped and I've been asked where I'm going when I haven't really done anything, or I've been pulled off corners when I'm talking with friends and people have suspected me of doing something when I wasn't. So I understand that. And I've also had family members and I've had close friends who've had to deal with the system and that sort of thing. So I've been close to that. I understand it. So I guess the best way to describe it was that I've had some experience of my own, and I've been close enough to people who've had experience that have been a lot harder than mine to see how these situations can play out. And I've been on the other side of it from a corporate standpoint, getting the ideas of how people who maybe feel a different way about these things. So I've seen both sides of that.
Are you able to tell when someone is just a plain old asshole versus when someone is, racially motivated? And how do you tell that difference? And then what role do narratives that are floating about change that perception of that very same event?
Mm-hmm. No, you're right. Yeah, there are assholes in the world, and there are people who are ignorant, and there are people who have an axe to grind about people. Sometimes that's racially motivated, sometimes it's not. But I think you have to factor in the point that someone who carries a badge and who carries a gun and who has the power of life and death over another individual, that ramps up the consequences of how they may interact with the public to 1,000. Now, of course, once you have two people in a situation where the playing field is a little bit level as far as what the power is about, if you're in a situation where somebody's being rude to you and you can leave, or somebody's being rude to you, and if you try to leave, that you can end up dead. I think that's the deciding factor. Not to say that these things don't automatically go one way. I'm just saying that with some people, when they have a position of authority or they feel like they have power over another person, sometimes they can ramp up their asshole behavior to 100 and it can end in tragic consequences. Not saying that somebody may be doing something illegal, quote unquote, and they should be able to get away with that. I'm just saying that the way people move with each other when there's a perceived power difference makes all the difference.
That's true. I've had interactions with the cops, nothing major, but, in my thinking, and, I don't have that same context that you do, racially, especially. And, for me, I do see that power differential. I mean, you're talking about a guy with a gun who might not be the most trained, might not be the most educated, might be a little nervous in the situation where it's late, or they stop you or whatever. So to me, I have a very simple philosophy: live to fight another day, and not literally fight, but just like if something doesn't go as you would like it to go, be polite to the person with the weapon, and then deal with it, afterwards, and whatever, if there's court or you get a ticket or whatever the situation is. So I think there's, a level of just, submission to the reality of that power dynamic. And I feel like the in the ether right now is this: you have to fight it at that moment. And I don't know that that's the best sort of approach for anybody, regardless of race. Do you get that feeling that you're starting off with that antagonistic vibe, and it almost becomes sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy?
No, I really don't. I think you have to put this into context, because the idea of submitting to power is something, unfortunately, that African Americans have had to do since we landed here. This is not a new concept for us. We came here to be shadowed. We came here to be workers. We weren't really considered to be full human beings. So submission and trying to figure out how to survive in a brutal environment has been our modus operandi from day one. That's not a new thing. I think what you're seeing right now is because of, like I said before, this idea that social media puts everything, it makes everything immediate, and it puts every interaction on blast right then. I think what you're seeing is people who are to the point where they're tired of feeling like they have to submit to survive, even though we've had to do that for almost 500 years. So what you're seeing now is people who are really just demanding the rights that they see other people getting. Because look, we've seen interactions where we see how the cops can de-escalate and defuse situations when they choose to. I've seen video of white guys swinging machetes at cops. You know what I mean? And the cops will back up, and they will keep telling him to drop the weapon, or they will try to negotiate with him until they can either wrestle him down physically, or they get the weapon away from him. All a African American has to do is breathe sometimes, and that's enough. And I think there has to be some sort of differentiation between submission and being respectful, and submitting to letting your dignity get taken away from you, and your human rights, which everyone deserves, being taken away from you. I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Where I get concerned is that, because everyone has a cell phone and everyone is, sort of looking for incidents or filming incidents, and media has a certain narrative and a certain bias, that we're weaving together narratives and stories that sometimes amplify things that aren't as bad, and then de-emphasize things that are bad, but you don't get to see those things. And so that framing creates this weird imbalance in people's minds of what, the proportions are of things. So I'll give you a perfect example. They just did a survey. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but they did a survey of different groups, and they asked them, how many police killings are there, of unarmed black men, and the guesses were like huge. They were like, over 1,000, over whatever. On an average year, it's like, 10 to 20. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other, disgraceful incidents or injustices in those situations, but I think what this goes to show you is the sense of proportionality that is created by these horrific incidents that are publicized. So my concern is that, we pour energy, which is very important, into the things that you've described, and I agree that they're important, but we don't pour any energy into elevating the communities and the root causes of crime, and the family challenges and education and things that quite frankly, in terms of magnitude, are huge, but they don't have that same spectacular anecdotal quality that goes viral. So do you get the sense that we might be losing proportionality because of how these narratives are woven?
Well, I think some of that goes back to just classic media logic. If it bleeds, it leads. That's something that unfortunately is universal in print and video, and even especially in social media. I don't think we're so much losing the sense of proportion. I think what happens is we don't really talk about these things you describe, and these are very important things, is because they're not sexy. That's not to say that we're losing a sense. I don't think it's so much of a losing a sense of proportion as it is that because these things are more long-term effects, and because these things happen over generations and over a span of generations, sometimes it's hard to hold the interest of the general public to talk about these things because number one, it's uncomfortable to talk about. And number two, it's harder for the public, not disrespecting the public's intelligence, but it's harder for the public to grasp all these things. You know what I mean? We live in a culture where everything is immediate. So talking about things that have been going on since the 60s, since the 50s, and sometimes all the way back to the 1800s, is hard for people to get a grasp on. I think there should be more conversation about that sort of thing. And I think it is starting to happen. But I think what's happening is because what you see on the street, on the ground, that second is so immediate, that grabs people's attention. I think that's why I think what should happen. I don't think it's disproportionate. I just think that one is a lot more sensational than the other, but it's all important in my opinion.
Will it lead us to the best policies is my question, or the best approaches to solving things? Because I think if we even retrain the police departments and we equalize how people are treated with dignity, respect, we do all that. I still think the massive underlying problems are there. And it's not to say that these are easy things to solve. They're not, but where is there too little focus in your view?
I think there's way too little focus on people who are doing work inside communities. I think there's been an overemphasis on electoral politics on a national level and not enough attention paid to people who are doing the work, like, on school boards, people who might be living in neighborhoods who are watching out for kids who are in the neighborhoods, people who are trying to build community gardens, people who are trying to uplift the communities. The media doesn't really go there and talk to these people, which is part of the reason why I wanted to start Context Media, because I know that there are people in every neighborhood who are doing that work, but nobody cares about them. And if how it is, if people don't see it, then it doesn't exist. I
Yeah.
think there needs to be more focus on that. It's like every 2 to 4 years, the whole country gets organized about national politics, and all of a sudden the media gets attention about who's going to be the next president, who's going to run. 2020, we saw that in widescreen, but there's no real conversation about people who are actually going to work every day, spending their money to like buy supplies for kids in their neighborhood. There's no conversation with real community organizers who are putting their money into trying to make sure that kids grow up or they have different options outside of seeing the neighborhood every day. That's why I think things need to start. And this stuff is going on. It's just people don't pay attention to it. So I think that's where focus needs to happen. That, and also if you're going to go into politics, I think local politics is very important as well. People don't realize that local elections have more effect on your everyday day-to-day life than national elections. I think that's where the focus needs to go to start.
That's great. I've made that point so many times as well about local, because change happens bottom up. But the sensationalism and the Trump tweeting or some big 4-year election and all these big promises that mostly never happen. Those are they're great stories that engage everybody, but ultimately that's not what helps people. And I wrote a piece about poverty a while back, and I talked about some of these. I specified groups that are actually helping the homeless, the people with mental health challenges, people who are reuniting people who have drug addiction. There's actually good stuff happening. Just doesn't have that sensational. There's no like RNG bad man making tweets. And it's just not as sexy. And Unfortunately, I don't know how that changes, but almost you could see, like, if you were to create a conspiracy, if you were a conspiracy minded person and you saw sort of election after election, promise after promise of fixing poverty, fixing community, and then nothing happens, whether it's a Democratic a mayor or governor, or a Republican mayor, governor, like all these cities, like things don't change. And I remember here on the East Coast, Cory Booker tried to do a lot of things, and he had kind of a spotty record because it's hard. I mean, it's hard to change and uplift a community. That takes years. And this year they've actually shown progress because they have a lower level of violence than they've had in history. So he was part of that change. He was that sort of stepping stone towards a better future. But it's slow, and that doesn't make the news. The slow things. People want these sensational things. But there's also a lot of sort of phony promises that keep, or at least in my view, keep the Black community as a voting bloc without actually delivering the goods. Year after year, left and right. So how do you not be cynical? How much do you really expect from government? I'll pose that to you as a question.
Oh, trust me, that's a great question, and trust me, I'm very cynical about government. You're absolutely right. I've talked a lot about this on social media, and it's gotten me a lot of heat in certain areas, but it's also gotten a lot of people who understand what I'm saying. There's this thing that happens in the Black community when it comes to politics. Every 2 to 4 years, politicians who you never see any other time show up on the block, and they show up at churches, and they show up at stadiums and whatnot to come basically massage the Black community. And what I mean by that is they show up, they give you a lot of feel good, they give you some sort of great value, some great value church rhetoric that sounds good and it feels good. And then when they leave, once they feel like they've gotten your vote, and you don't see them again for another 4 years. I think what happened in 2020 was that you saw a real awakening of a younger demographic of African-American voter who were not necessarily traditionally conservative in the way of a Trump conservative, but they were starting to demand tangibles for their votes. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but there's sort of this there's a thing happening among the Black electorate where you have a huge block of older Black voters who are above around 50 to 65 or so. And you also have a block of younger voters who are 18 and up. And they're diametrically opposed, and they want different things. For the most part, a lot of the older Black voters come out of that civil rights era where everything was tied to, the vote is everything. And, and they're rightfully so, because, they know the history of being denied the vote and having to go fight and die and be brutalized to get the right to vote. You also have a lot of younger Black voters who are like, they didn't grow up in that, but they grew up with student loan debt, and they grew up with police brutality, and they grew up with no jobs, and they grew up in communities that are in food deserts and economic deserts, and they want more than that. And they're looking around at who their parents and their grandparents have been voting for, and they want tangibles now. So that's what's happening now. You have these two diametrically opposed groups, and the people in the same group who are clashing. But a lot of that old stuff that they mentioned isn't working anymore. That younger demographic is going into the workforce, and they're becoming a power block. So that's what we saw last year. It's going to take more than that. It's not going to work anymore from either side.
So to go back to my question then, if you were to sit down with a young person in the Black community, someone who's, let's say, 12 years old, so they, old enough to understand, some guidance, what advice would you be giving them, and how much of it is sort of centered on things they can do versus things they should advocate for others to do for them? What would that advice be, and how would you split that? They only have so much time in the day. So where do you want them to spend their time building their future?
That's a really good question. If I had to answer that young person, I would say, think about what you love, and think about what you're good at, and then try to align with people who see the good in you and love you, who are in power or trying to create access to power, and build with them. That doesn't mean automatically go to somebody who always looks like you. It means find people who really see your worth and see your value as a human being and build with them. I think that's the best thing I could say.
That's a great answer. My concern is that the helpers that either designated themselves to be helpers or, have been anointed are not helping. And I think there are two types of racism in modern day. There used to be a lot more, but and both of them come out of ignorance, because I think you could end up in two different places. One is, now I'll get back around to the original point I started with, but if you don't grow up with minorities, with blacks, with, sort of a diverse friend group or whatever, you can go one of two ways, right? You can hate someone because, ignorance breeds hate, or you can almost lionize them in some weird way, or fetishize them. And so now you have either, an enemy, or I hate to say it, it's so condescending, it almost feels like a child or a pet. And it's both of them are gross. You know what I mean? Like it's sort of like I will help you, and I'm like, who are you? how are you going to help me? You can barely help yourself. And so I feel like those people with this other type of racism are somehow writing the agendas. And I don't think they know what the right answers are, or nor does their ideology seem to align with the advice you just outlined for that 12-year-old kid. So like, who are these people, and why are they in charge, seemingly?
Whew, man, that's a hot one. Let's see.
All yours now.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. And again, I've seen these people up close. I think what you're talking about is
how
people,
they don't live in your neighborhood. They would have to drive like 40 miles to find you, because like that's the crazy thing. It's like, and they're speaking for you. Alyssa Milano is your spokesperson now.
No, you know
Good
what?
luck.
No, here's the thing about that. I think I know what you're talking about. You're talking about people who actually may be coming from a very good place, but the way to approach people is very condescending and is very patronizing. And they feel like that the way to help you is to come in and swoop in like Superman and tell you that I'm here to help you, without really engaging with you, until asking you even asking you who you are, first of all, and asking you what you want. And I think there's two ways to go about that. I think one way is, there are people who come in like that, and then they're a very small minority of them, but there are people who come in like that, and once they actually try to make the effort to talk to people in neighborhoods or people who are actually doing activist work, they're willing to be educated. But again, that's a very small minority. The majority of people who do this are people who are trying to basically self-aggrandize themselves and show themselves to the world that I'm an activist, and look at me come into this neighborhood and look how I'm picking up these poor downtrodden people. That is what you see. And these are also the people who have access to media. You know what I mean? They have access to podcasts. They are able to make the connections to get themselves on CNN and to get themselves on TV and portray themselves as the savior of everybody else. I think what's happening with that is that they are often, a lot of times, more detrimental to the people they claim to help than the people who are active enemies, because they don't listen. And because they're so caught up in their own self-image that they don't really want to help anybody outside of themselves. I think that's very dangerous. You know what I mean? It's like the people who are going to help you to death. You know what I mean?
That's great. I love that line. That's great. And this reminds me, as I look at the picture behind you of Malcolm X, I, for the longest time, was very... ignorant is a good way to put it, because look, when you grow up, you go to school, you kind of learn this very simplistic version. Malcolm X stood for this, for violence any means necessary. MLK was the peaceful guy, and it was this sort of simplistic, a couple of bullet points and you're done, and you pass your test. But recently, I've kind of fell into a YouTube rabbit hole, watching and listening to some of his speeches, and stupid me for not having done that homework before. But what I was impressed by in his message, two things that hit me specifically. One is exactly what you said: helping people to to death, which is he did not trust, he did a whole speech about white liberals. It's like a 7.5 minute clip. People should look it up. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly the person that you just described. And I almost feel like that's worse. And because to me, like, if you hate me, I'd rather know that you hate me. But if you're pretending to help me, or you're self-aggrandizing, to make yourself look like some great savior, that's gross. And mm-hmm. and that's what he was talking about. And so, the second part of what impressed me about him is how much of his message was about self-empowerment, and not, sort of relying on these saviors that are going to show up, once every 2 to 4 years, or or come in with these, these seemingly good intentions, but a lot of times bad ideas, or in some ways cynical ones. So what is it about Malcolm X, and does that resonate with you, or at least my characterization of it? And then maybe you can fill in some other things that maybe strike you about his message.
No, that's very accurate. And I think it's really good that you mentioned the fact that what you got in school was a sort of like one-dimensional image of what he stood for. I think because at the time, Martin Luther King was sort of like the approved messenger of Black civil rights. And he was people got a one-dimensional image of him too. It was about like turn the other cheek and this sort of thing. Whereas Malcolm was like, let's get guns and let's do what we need to do. But people don't understand that really there was not that much dissimilarity between what Malcolm X was talking about and Martin Luther King was talking about. They both were talking about self-respect and also talking about economic empowerment. They were also talking about doing for self as well. If you look at some of Martin Luther King's later speeches, he was talking about we're coming to get our check right before he was assassinated. He was basically talking about reparations in a way. And he was talking about the fact that we need to build for ourselves and this country owes us a debt. Malcolm was saying the same thing, but his message was more of like, we have enough power within ourselves. He talked about how the black dollar circulated at that time. I'm probably going to fudge this, but he said it was like 6 to 10 times, whereas like the dollar in other communities circulates 10, sometimes 20 times. We're still having that conversation today. He was saying, let's pool our wealth, let's pool our resources and build up an economic infrastructure that we can compete with every other ethnic group in this country. That's all he was really saying. He was saying defend that, true, but he was really saying let's build up an infrastructure, let's build up a culture and community that we can take care of ourselves. And this is a conversation that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but we actually had something like that up until the late 60s. Unfortunately, it was created by Jim Crow and segregation. But if you take a look at the number of Black businesses, Black newspapers, Black professionals that we had from 1870, I think, up to 1880, up until the 1950s and 60s, we had more then than we do now. And
yeah, there was even a community, I think in the 20s or 30s. It was like I forgot the what they call it. It's like the Black Fifth Avenue, or the Black, like it was.
You're talking about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Tulsa, Oklahoma. Yeah. And that was broken up by some sort of like, they built something over it, and it was like eminent domain, and they took over those housing, or something.
That happened in several places. No, Tulsa was actually burned to the ground. That's what happened with Black Wall Street. That happened in 1921, I believe. That was burned and bombed to the ground. Now that's a whole nother conversation. But there are a lot of neighborhoods that happened to. In Atlanta, Sweet Auburn used to be the sort of like the economic center, Black economic center of Atlanta. They passed an ordinance in the late 50s that put an overpass over that area, and it basically destroyed the neighborhood and broke it up. That happened in Overtown in Miami. I think that happened in Chicago, and it happened in a couple of other cities in the Midwest where like eminent domain, which has been a weapon of white supremacy that's basically taken economic wealth out of Black communities. That's the thing. But getting back to your original point, I think there has to be a conversation again, and you're starting to see it again, about economic empowerment amongst us as a community. The same thing that every other group has done, like Asian Americans have done, Indian Americans have done, European Americans, even if you break that down into groups, Irish and Italians and everyone else has done that. I think there's a conversation about that is happening again in the Black community, and how does that tie into electoral politics, and how does that work again? So that's really what Malcolm X was standing for. You know what I mean? And a lot of groups were. It's just that you didn't get that message because they saw the imagery And because we live in a very one-dimensional media culture, the image of him with his fist up or yelling, going like this, carries a lot further than his message.
Yeah, it's interesting, and but I don't think we're heading towards a better understanding of that message or the direction that he intended, because I don't think. I'll call them grifters. You don't have to agree with this, but people like D'Angelo, like Kendi, and so on. I don't think what they're preaching is self empowerment. I think what they're preaching is something very different. I think it's a form of appeasement through government policy that changes the standards and changes the numbers, or maybe creates some different quotas or something, but it never actually goes to the root and elevates the people, the way that Malcolm X was talking about in terms of self-empowerment. So it's a certain cosmetic thing that's happening, and that's dominating the discourse. And I don't know if you're getting that same feeling, but certainly, like, what I see happening, it's like, if you, let's say, get rid of the SATs as they're talking about doing, did you help the people who weren't scoring well? Or did you just get rid of a thing that it allows you to erase a statistic that doesn't look good for you? And so my question is, why aren't we helping those who are underperforming perform better, rather than creating this sort of cosmetic thing that I guess makes some people feel better or look good, but doesn't actually get to the root of self-empowerment?
I've heard that conversation before, and I think you have to preface that by saying that a lot of times some of the curriculum and some of the standards and standardized tests do have an inherent bias. If you look at who is really creating these tests, and if you look at what the curricular and the questions are on some of these tests. Now, 2 + 2 has to equal 4, true enough. Those are things that you can't really get around.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's actually been subject to debate lately.
No, I get that. I mean, there are some hard things like the sciences and things that where you have to meet a certain standard. No, but also what we have to talk about too is, like, some of these tests aren't just based in science and in hard mathematics. Some of these things are based in culture and they're based in history. And then you have to ask, whose history are you teaching? And then you have to ask yourself, whose culture is making these tests? I'm not in favor personally of getting rid of certain standardized testing, but I do think some testing needs to be modified to respect the fact that people are coming from different backgrounds, are coming from different cultural backgrounds, and to open that up. You understand what I'm saying?
I do, but where I would push back on that is, there's a level of empiricism that exists across the world. So there's like a PISA test that tests all the kids all over the world every 2 years, I think. And it's the sciences, it's mathematics, and you consistently see Asian countries just kicking our asses in terms of performance on that test, which is, global standard, not just US. So there's a way to normalize, to extract, to take out the cultural dynamic that you're talking about and simply isolate, the math, the science, we're talking about biology, we're talking about chemistry and physics and so on. Like, gravity's still going to exist whether you're black or white. I mean, like, you drop the ball, it's going to fall. And so, and I feel like the Asian countries get that, and they're deeply rooted in empiricism, while we are projecting cultural problems onto those things that should be empirical. And I agree with you that there are things that are culturally different and subjects that would create those differences and variances. But when we're talking about biology and we're talking about chemistry and math, I don't know that I feel comfortable projecting that, because there are sort of global universal type measures, and we're not competing in isolation in the United States. There's a whole busy world, and if we're not going to do the next sort of innovation and do the science and the research and the development of the future, then South Korea is going to do it, or China is going to do it. And so I don't think we can afford the empirical stuff to become politicized in this way. At least that's my pushback.
No, I get that. Then I think what has to happen from that point is, if you really want to raise the standards of the broad spectrum of American students, then you have to find ways to reach out to those kids and teach them in a way that you may not be able to have to teach somebody in a different neighborhood. That doesn't mean you have to change the curriculum as far as like what the hard facts and evidence and data is. You just have to find a way to make that data and make that evidence more engaging to that child and make that person engage with it from the way that they understand it. You're not going to reach every single person, but I think there has to be a fundamental change in the way people are taught. And you have to be able to create standards that reach everybody, but still be standards. Now, I don't have the answer for that, but I do know that the way I'm talking to you is totally different than the way I'm going to talk to somebody I don't know, or the way I go to talk to somebody who I've known for 20 years, or somebody who's in my family. You know what I mean? You may try to communicate the same message, but you got to talk to them different ways. You know what I mean? To get to the point.
Yeah.
I think that has to happen. I'm very wary of turning a conversation about really hard education and empirical evidence into this version of the bell curve where it becomes this thing where like, well, these people are unteachable, so we'll just leave them to be a permanent underclass. I think there are people in even some of the poorest neighborhoods who are innovators. I think there are people who are brilliant, there are kids there who are geniuses. I mean, if you go on TikTok, there's kids who are making content that are better than some of the damn movies that are coming out right now with a cell phone. I mean, there's people who are online right now making their own TV shows, and I would rather sit up and watch them in the morning than watch some of the stuff that's on Netflix. There's innovators in every neighborhood. They just have to be reached and developed in different ways, I think.
Yeah, and you know, I saw a story like a year or so ago about India, and you know, and I forget what's the expression. Necessity breeds, or I'm going to butcher it. So
necessity is the mother of invention, I think.
Yes, thank you. Necessity is the mother of invention, and the people that were covered in the story were so poor, but they figured out a way to create light in these sort of cavernous dwellings, and to create clothing out of things you would never create clothing from. So the innovation is there, and it's a level of necessity that we certainly have here, but I also think we take for granted our starting point, because even if you're here, no matter what racial group or social class, like we exist squarely in the middle, if not the higher end of pretty much every category compared to the rest of the world. And I think that that affords us, like you just said, TikTok or whatever, we have access to these cheap tools that are almost universally accessible to that can change people's lives. Like, if someone can do special effects in a video. In fact, there was a guy who did like this sort of lightsaber thing and these special effects things where he's like changing into Spider-Man and all these characters. He got an offer from, I think it was like from Marvel, because he did such a great job in this short little clip. He created a job for himself just by putting it out there. And so I think unlocking that is so important. And then my question then is, does the way we do that have to vary by race? How culturally how tied into culture is it? So is the way that you help a Black kid in the inner city that different from the way you would help a poor kid with, also, maybe a single parent or poverty, or maybe a drug addicted, family, whatever it is? Would you necessarily approach it differently? And then is it helpful to racialize the solutions?
Okay. I think it is. And and I'm going to preface that by saying this. You have to understand that a lot of times people even in other countries and even in other communities in America have access, even though they're poor or relatively poor, because it's all relative, they may have access to resources that somebody in the inner city may not have. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to stick with the TikTok thing. I can't think of this girl's name, but you might have seen it. There was some girl who, a blonde white girl, who was doing like these dances on TikTok. It's like every week she would come up with some new dance, not come up with, but she would basically imitate some dance that she saw little Black girls in the neighbor on a block doing. And she would basically reinterpret them, let's say it. And she was getting like 100,000 hits just off doing it because she's a pretty blonde white girl. After about the span of a month, she ended up being on Jimmy Kimmel doing the same dances. You see what I'm saying?
She's the Elvis of TikTok.
Pretty much. You see what I'm saying? But I don't know what her family background is, but she had an infrastructure of people who responded to her because we live in a majority white country. She's a pretty white girl. She's doing dances to trap music that people can respond to, but they don't have to see the black kids who are doing this. She managed to parlay that into somebody in Hollywood seeing her, putting her on Jimmy Kimmel. What happened with that though was the backlash started was because people who knew that these dances were done by little black girls in the hood who didn't have access to people who lived in LA, who didn't know how to reach out to agents, and who weren't quote unquote, attracted to the people who make these decisions, she was able to parlay that into like showing up on Jimmy Kimmel and making tons of money that way. That's what I mean when I say you have to factor in the racial characteristics of how these things happen, because these people sometimes who are able to capitalize on these things don't have access to the same resources that somebody like that young lady did. You know what I mean? That's why you have to make a special effort to kind of reach out to these people and give them an opportunity.
I agree with what you're saying, but in your example, I'm not sure that I'd be able to draw the line between hot and white. So like no one's ever bought me. I've never gotten a free drink in a bar ever. Like this face does not get any free anything in a bar. I've paid for every drink and then some. So then my question is, how much of it is because if it was like a pretty black girl or a pretty Hispanic or Indian or whatever, maybe she would have gotten the same thing. So I don't know if I could clearly draw that line there. Is that fair to say as well?
Well, you got to look at who's making the decisions. The people who are controlling the industry, as far as like from agents, talent bookers, and all this thing, they're mostly white people. And you can say what you want to say, but people automatically are attracted to people who are like them as a rule. Now, there's exceptions to that. Of course, we have people who date interracially. Of course, we see that happen. But I'm saying most people are looking for people who mirror what they find attractive. If the majority of the agents and the majority of the decision makers in Hollywood and in TV and press agents are all white, I think most of them are going to start looking at people who kind of look like them and they can identify with, quote unquote, and they're going to give them shots. I've actually had this conversation with people who worked in Silicon Valley. I can't think of the guy's name right offhand, but he made this he did this essay about a year or so ago talking about diversity in tech. And he made the point of saying that I'm going to look for somebody who knows how to play golf more than I'm going to look for somebody who shoots hoops. He didn't say anything racially, but let's be honest. Let's look at the connotations of that. I think that's what we have to factor in. I'm not saying that you have to automatically go out and look for somebody who's specifically black. And yes, attractiveness and hotness, quote unquote, does factor into these things, but that's all filtered through. We have to look at whose lens that's being filtered through. That's all I'm saying. And we have to take that into consideration.
The question is, can you swap out everyone's lenses and how do you do that? Because I think on some level, the most you can do, and this is my take, and I'd love to get your feedback, I think you can get people to acceptance. I don't know that you could get people to love, not by any kind of legal mechanism or regulatory mechanism. So I think once you get to acceptance, it's up to then the individual to demonstrate their value, their talent, and so on. And that's how I view a lot of these movies. Like, you could only stuff so much wokeness down someone's throat if the product isn't great. And if the product is great, then you'll have the market, because I don't care if it's an all black cast. If it makes me laugh, I'm there. And so, so I don't have to go see an all white comedy. I don't have to see I'm not even going to judge in that respect, because the best thing in the market should win. And even like, I don't know, and I've said this in some other episode, I'm like, I don't know any like rich white guy who's racist enough to deny himself cash. I'm going to pass over all of these qualified minorities and talented people just so I can be racist. Because at the end of the day, if the market is there, then the diversity will blossom.
You know what? I wish I could agree with that, but we've seen too many examples of the contrary. I mean, look what happened with what's the guy that used to own the Clippers, Donald Sterling? He was making tons of money he was making tons of money off the Clippers. You know what I mean? He showed up in the front row and clapped like everybody else because they were making money for him. Now that's kind of contradictory to your point. But
wait, how so? How's that contradictory? Just so I understand it.
No, because you said that you don't know any rich white guys who are not going to hire black people are going to deny themselves money because they don't like black people.
But didn't he have a team that was mostly black and successful and paid well?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's why I said it's contradictory to your point. He was happy to make money off the Clippers and everything, and I agree with that. However, That's the conversation of having field workers and having fellow bosses. You see what I'm saying? He was happy to have the Clippers out there working on the field for him. You know what I mean? But he didn't want him in his house. He wasn't gonna. Who's on the Clippers right now? Steph Curry. He didn't want Steph Curry coming to his house to cut any kind of deals for ownership. See, that's where things get tricky.
Yeah, I think ownership is interesting, and I posted this a while back, or I think I did this on an episode. Joe Budden did a very interesting sort of diatribe rant about this concept of ownership and multi-generational wealth, and that's how he wants to dedicate his creative energies and building those kinds of things. I think Charlemagne the God also said something along those lines. I agree with that absolutely, and it's in line with the Malcolm X stuff we talked about earlier. But I don't have generational wealth. I'm an immigrant. So, I came here with nothing. So anything that I make or do whatever and leave to my kids, that's step one, right? I'm at ground zero of whatever wealth is going to be built. There was no, there was no farm, there was no plantation, there's no anything. We showed up, I was 6 years old when we immigrated from the Soviet Union, and that's that, and so then, it's hard to build multi-generational wealth, and there will always be people who had advantages, sometimes structural advantages because the society favored certain people or certain races and so on, and then sometimes just starting points. It sucks. I know people who went into finance, or people who invested in Bitcoin early, and now they're buying boats. So it's we're not all gonna ever start from the same starting point. So I don't know that equality is a realistic expectation, but I think access to opportunity is where I would put my energies, and certainly have in the past, in terms of volunteering and junior achievement and doing things like that, and coaching kids. But how realistic is that? Multi-generational wealth, and can that be done through reparations? Can that be done? Is there a mechanism that is feasible and satisfying and still achieves what Steph Curry owning the team would be? And even then, it's Steph Curry the guy. It's not Steph Curry the representative of all the other, because all the other black people are going to have a piece of the team. Steph Curry is going to have that that piece. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like I'm doing this. I'm getting wealthy for all of you. I don't know if I buy that. That's a bit of a cynical message sometimes when I hear it. And so like Joe Budden, when he says, I believe him, but I also think Joe Budden wants to build his, name, build his wealth, and build his empire, but not to the sole benefit of other people. I think he can bring others along, and I think that's where we can really help people, where we can bring them along, and not just people who look like you, but other people who don't look like you.
No, look, I understand. I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you to a point. You're right. Everybody doesn't have the same origin story, and everybody doesn't start on the same plane. One thing I do want to push back on about what you said is that even though you may have came from the Soviet Union and you came with nothing, you said at 6, right?
Yeah.
When you come to America, you have a fundamental baseline of whiteness that opens up a lot of doors. I don't know your direct story, but there's a fundamental baseline of whiteness in America that is willing to open doors for people who look white enough to be able to have access to certain things. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. That doesn't mean that every single white person in America is going to be able to access that, but that is a baseline that has been proven by data that shows that someone who has the right name, if they have the right skin tone that looks good to somebody who's hiring, who is going to be, for the most part in America, is going to be white, that gives you a leg up over somebody who may even come in from a country that might be an immigrant from Africa or from the Caribbean who has to deal with the same thing. Now, again, it's not a 100% cut and dry rule, but that's a thing that we have to be honest about and we have to deal with. Now, aside from that,
wait, I want to push back on what you just said. If you could just, whatever you were going to say next, just don't lose it.
Okay.
I would believe that, if not for two things. One is, if you look at the data of the highest earners in the United States, It's not white people at the top of the list. It's Asian. It's Indian. There's a lot of Nigerians. I think they're like at 77,000 a year. They're above white people. White people aren't doing so great. They were towards the bottom of that specific list, and that was based on cultural identity. So I don't know that whiteness is necessarily fair to identify as. It's convenient politically, and I'm not saying you're doing anything untoward. I understand why, because we have a certain history, and that history justifies a certain level of that. So I get that, but I also think that there's that, and there's also the invisible disadvantages and advantages that we never talk about, because it is helpful if you're trying to make a racial advancement argument to talk about white and black. But when you include all those other races and the stats and how they're performing, and then you also include all the things you can't see, the drug addicted parent, the abusiveness, maybe childhood illness, maybe, other things that people have, had, and issues that they've had, maybe they were in poverty sometimes. You can't see those things. Like black and white, you can definitely see. Mm-hmm. But there's so many invisible advantages and disadvantages. We talked about hot privilege earlier. Mm-hmm. There are things that are not visible to the eye that are just as important. But I don't think it's fair to take a sliver that makes an effective political point without taking the entire universe of pros and cons in. We're not a concentrated vial of negativity or bad experiences. So I don't know that we need to be treated more like individuals, and that's kind of my problem with this group breakdown that we're doing now, because I think we still have to end up at the individual, and the what's right for one person isn't going to be right for another, even if they share the same physical characteristics, and they're not going to have the same advantages. I didn't speak the language when I came here. Where's that register on the, sort of the intersectional spectrum? It doesn't. And so I don't know that we can sanction one advantage or disadvantage to the exclusion of others in light of the data as well. That's I'm getting off my soapbox right now.
No, that's all good. No, I understand that. I'm just saying that I'm not saying that this is the total factor. I'm just saying that it's something that you have to take into consideration is what I'm saying. Now, aside from that, you're right that different individuals are going to have different advantages and disadvantages. I'm just saying that when you take it outside of the individual and even outside of the grouping, you have to look at the structural idea of what you have to look at the structural situation of what is supported and what is not. I think you've just started to see that begin. People are starting to pay attention to that just in the past year and take a hard look at that sort of thing. But there are advantages and disadvantages depending on where you come from and where you are. I mean, you said that Asians. Did you say that it was Asians that are in the highest earning percentage right now?
Yeah, Asians were 100. Family income was. They're the only group over 100,000 in terms of family income or household income. I think they were like 103,000 last time I saw. I don't have the chart in front of me, but that's pretty impressive. And so then my question is, and we do this as human beings. This isn't just this particular debate or this the racial aspect of it. There's a certain level of internalization and externalization. And I feel like all of our conversations now are externalized. It's like, what is someone else doing bad to me, or what good things can they do for me? It's like the JFK speech, ask not what your country can do for you. Like, it would be completely flipped today. It would be like, ask not what, you could do for your country, ask what your country could do for you. And I think we're doing that. My question is, for example, the Brookings Institution, which is, I think, left-leaning think tank, and they put out a few years ago the 3 rules of avoiding poverty. They said you're virtually guaranteed, like 98+% guaranteed to evade poverty if you do 3 things. One is finish school. Second was get a job. Third was get into a stable relationship before having kids. And so do those three things and you are guaranteed to stay out of poverty. Now, those things resonate with me just because, I'm an immigrant. That's how I think. That's how my parents think. So it's logical to me. And what I also like about it, because I have a libertarian streak, so it's like, oh, those are things I can control. I don't have to sit and wait for government or Bernie Sanders or, a movement of any kind or protesters to fix me. And so my question is, where can we do more in terms of, because to me, that's real empowerment. Where is that real empowerment going to come from? And can you do that? And can enough people have that accountability conversation where it's not all externalized, where we're waiting for some savior from the outside to help you? So where can we do better in terms of us, exerting effort to change our situations versus waiting for, saviors?
I think what has to happen is, first of all, you have to give people, like you said earlier, I think people have to have opportunity or be made aware of what opportunities are there for them. Everybody does not come with the same sort of skill set as far as like being aware of what they might be able to take advantage of and what they might not be able to take advantage of. I mean, look, we're in the middle where they say we're in the end of a pandemic. There were a lot of things that small businesses could have done, and that there were a lot of grants and there were a lot of things that even the majority of successful small business owners had no clue that they could take advantage of until the pandemic hit and the government said, hey, these are things that are available if you want to be able to keep your business afloat. A lot of those things were emergency measures. A lot of them had been there for years, but they hadn't publicized them. It's all about knowledge. And I'm not talking about knowledge that you get out of an institution or university. A lot of the knowledge that helps people become successful is things that are passed along by people that they know. How many times have you had a friend tell you something that, hey, you need to reach out about this and you need to go see this and maybe that'll help you out? What happens in a lot of African-American communities and sometimes in a lot of impoverished communities is that information doesn't get translated down to people who need it. I think that has to happen. As far as the idea of looking for a savior, I don't really see the government or any politician as a savior at all, period. We already discussed that. But I think that there are things that legislation and I think things the government can do to try to inform the public about things that they can take advantage of and maybe level the playing field that way to help people, to help themselves, quote unquote. But that has to be a lateral thing. It can't just be somebody coming down from on high to help you out. And you have to, and the people on the ground have to have spokespeople, first of all, who are really concerned about their well-being, who will go to people in power and tell them what they need. I think that's what's happening. There's a disconnect between people who are hurting and people who need some assistance and the people who are able to maybe help them to find them assistance for themselves and maybe help some way, because nobody lives here by themselves. Everybody needs help one way or another. I think it's kind of a callous thing to say that everybody has to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps when some people don't have boots. I know that's a kind of a cliche thing to say, but if you're going to do that, you have to give people an option. You have to give people information and knowledge to help themselves.
I want to distinguish between BLM the concept and BLM the movement. So BLM the concept, I'm all in, but BLM the movement, I got a few problems. And a lot of their a lot of their ideology and this is because I'm from the Soviet Union. We escaped the a lot of the ideas that they espouse, and so it's scary to me when there's such a thing as wrongthink, when people get fired for words, when language starts to get sort of manipulated and changed. There's a lot of things that I don't like, and one of the things that was in their platform, which I think they took off their website, but it was on there at some point, was that they're not for the traditional family. They want all different configurations of family to be just as good. Just speaking mathematically alone, 2 providers versus 1, 2 sets of grandparents versus 1 is a better mathematical framework and foundation for a child. So just on the math alone, I cannot support that at all. But I also don't look down on people who, by circumstances way well outside their control are born into those situations. Now, obviously we can't just forget about them. But to the extent that we can affect the future, isn't family still important? And why does no one talk about it?
Well, we're gonna get into the weeds on this one, but I'm ready for it.
Do it.
I think people are starting to wake up to it now. But there's three things that people need to understand when it comes to Black Lives Matter. There is the slogan Black Lives Matter. There is the movement that is formed around Black Lives Matter, and then you have the organization of Black Lives Matter. Those are, even though on the surface it looks like the same thing, those are three totally diametrically opposed things. I know diametrically means two, but you know what I mean.
I got it.
You see, Black Lives Matter as a slogan was basically created to raise an awareness of the fact that African Americans were being disproportionately discriminated against and killed by police officers at that time. And that came out of the Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown situation and Ferguson and everything that came out of that. The Black Lives Matter movement was the worldwide global mass movement that fought back against that. And that's where you saw the street protests and the people who were trying to put policy in place. That was the movement. That was the mass movement on the ground. People who were coming from poor neighborhoods in Ferguson and Ferguson, Missouri, and then like Miami, and then Baton Rouge and Baltimore, all these places. The Black Lives Matter organization is where the conversation that you just mentioned comes from. And the organization of Black Lives Matter has absolutely nothing to do with the slogan or the movement. That's where people get twisted up. You know what I mean? The people who are in control of the organization have become so disconnected from the people who are on the ground that they don't recognize each other anymore. So we want to get
they're
out.
in all new neighborhoods now.
Yeah, 4 of them apparently, if the stories are right. Yeah. So but you see what I'm saying? That's what people don't understand. I think people are waking up to it now because some of the stories are beginning to come out. But what you're seeing with that is something that's been talked about on the ground for at least 4 years now. People who are the people I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the people who are doing the grassroots work in the communities, who are looking out for kids, who are setting up breakfast programs in the tradition of the Panthers, that sort of thing. Those are the people who are not media savvy. They don't have access to TV. They don't have access to CNN. They don't have publicists. They don't have press because number one, they can't afford it. Number two, they're not trained in that sort of thing. They're too busy helping people who they're in their community, who they see every day. Those are people who could really be speaking truth to power and having conversations with people in power, but they can't because the people who are in the organizations are in the way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as far as the conversation that they took out of the platform that they took out about being against the nuclear family, a lot of that came from the fact that a lot of people who were in the organization, who were promoted in the organization, come out of academia. And in academia, you can make any theory make sense because you're in a classroom. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a lot of people,
it never has to stand up to the real world.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people who were putting that platform together, there were some very good things in them. Some of it was derivative of the Panther platform, but a lot of it comes from a lot of third wave feminism and a lot of ideas that don't have anything to do with the hard reality of being a Black mother or a Black father in a hood. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's what I'm saying. A lot of that stuff has no real ground to stand on the streets. So it sounds good in an academic setting or if you're in seminars or anything, but if you take that out of the seminar world and try to take it into a block, they're going to laugh you out of the street. They're going to laugh you out of there.
Well, it's funny. I had Pastor A.R. Bernard on my show. We did a live event. I guess it was early last year. And before the event, I went to his church. He has a mega church, the biggest one in New York City. It's like an entire square block in Brooklyn. It's gigantic. And I went to to his to his service on Sunday morning, and I looked around, it was all Black audience, and except for me, but
did you clap?
Of course, I got into it. I'm like, I could see because it was a show. I mean, it was a proper, the music, the singing. He's got like a whole band shell in the corner. I mean, this was a pretty. I think it seats like 3,700 people. It's huge. Anyway, so but when I looked back, it was families. It was, everyone was all dressed up with the kids. It was, if you told me Patrisse Cullors or any of the organizers we just discussed speak for the people in that room, I would not believe you for a second. And so I think that it's funny because a lot of the people who say liberal things live conservative lives. or aspire to. They want, good school for their kids. They want a family. They want, they want stability. They want safety. They want all those things. And it's not conservative politically, but conservative, lifestyle wise. And the people in that room, in that giant, auditorium, were conservative people. And so where is their voice? Because it used to be, people like Pastor A.R. Bernard, and to some extent it still is, but is the church still relevant in speaking for those groups, or do they need someone to speak for them? Is there a better form of leadership that's not coming out of BLM? Because we hear a lot about, sort of that woke side of the equation. Where's the family side of the equation? Where are those leaders, and are they necessary, or how do we get to a place where family is back in vogue again?
Well, the family was never out of vogue in the Black community, and real, actual community work has never been out of vogue. What's happened is the people who have control of the microphone and the people who have the cameras have an agenda that's totally different than what people who are on the ground are doing. There are, like I said at the beginning, there are people who are actually doing that work, and there are people who are centered in like raising economic standards for their families and being able to leave a legacy for their families. It's just that you don't see them. They're there. Every neighborhood has those people. It's just that they don't have access to the media the way other people are. I'm going to give you an example. There was a young man. I'm going to go back to the BLM thing again. There was a young man in Ferguson named Darren Seals. Darren Seals was an auto worker in St. Louis. He worked 12 to 16-hour shifts. When Mike Brown was killed, he was on the street every night leading protests against what was going on there. He was a very articulate young man. He was a very, very passionate, very vocal. He was not media trained by any stretch of the imagination, but he was very engaging. And he was very concerned about his neighborhood. He did not come from the Black Lives Matter organizational school. He was very much, for lack of a better term, he was a hood cat. He was very blunt in what he had to say, but he was very concerned about his people. Unfortunately, he died in 2018. He was murdered. And what happened was he was sort of like a microcosm of the people who you're talking about, people who may not be media savvy, may not be media trained, but they have the best interests of themselves and their community at heart. But because they don't say the right things and they don't have the right buzzwords, they never get a voice. You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's what has to happen. And I think what has to happen is the people who really are concerned about their communities have to be recentered. It has to come out of this performative wokeness, which is what I call it. It has to come out of the sloganeering, and it has to come out of these ideas that have no basis in reality on the ground with people who are dealing with. That has to happen. I think you do need leadership, but you can't have leadership that's being handed down to you. It has to come from the people themselves. And if they're given that opportunity, they'll create their own leadership.
Yeah, and there's something to be said for just basic foundations, and one of the slogans that bothers me, and I'm sure bothers a lot of people, the defund the police slogan. Without safety, you can't have other things, that are necessary, right? You can't have, now how you achieve safety is certainly, debatable, and there are better ways than we're doing it today. But, I think so many of the things are kind of destructive in this narrative that's pervading, and they're having a lot of influence on policy. Like I see this in corporate settings now too. I mean, you had your run in corporate for probably, would you say 10 years?
Almost, yeah. Had to
almost
escape.
10 years. Yeah. What were you doing in corporate? I'm just curious.
I was in records, and I worked in insurance for a while. I did that. And then I also worked in the art world. I worked for a gallery for a while, which isn't technically corporate, but there's a lot of corporate mentality that goes along with all that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. And so, more institutional type corporate, these large corporations, they're putting on a show also, right? There's a lot of this performative wokeness, and they're putting out messaging that sort of, checks all the right boxes. I don't know if you saw the CIA commercial that they put out.
I saw it.
They tossed in every single buzzword. I'm like, you depose governments. Like, how woke can you be?
Yeah, the FBI's got one out now too with a black woman with I think she's got a shirt on or something like that. I'm like, yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's kind of, it's a way of pacifying people and, making whatever it is you're going to do, let you continue doing it. But I think going back to, the communities, like you need safety. You need institutions that are, providing those foundations and, like places for kids to go, that aren't the streets, that aren't drugs, that aren't, whatever, vices are out there. What responsibility do people who've made it have to go back? Like I know LeBron is open to school. I know some other celebrities do a variety of things, but it's not just celebrities. I'm talking about some guy who maybe made it out of the hood to some finance executive position. That guy, does he have some sort of accountability to come back? And what can a person like that do? And are there places for them to go to plug into organizations that are on the ground in those communities?
All right. Well, I want to answer your first question. You talked about defund the police.
Sorry, I threw a lot at you.
No, that's okay. I think I'm going to be honest. I don't really have a problem with the slogan defund the police. I think what it is because it hits people so heavy, they automatically think that means strip all the police away from America and let everybody run wild, like when the cops went on strike on RoboCop. I think that's what the average person thinks of when they hear that slogan. I really do. I think the basis of that slogan is there has been an extreme militarization of the police, and we saw that with the protests that happened. When you see cops pulling up dressed like the cops from Judge Dredd and they're in armored personnel carriers and shit like that. I think that's what people really mean when they say defund the police. I think what they really mean is demilitarize the police, because a lot of military hardware that came back from Iraq.
That's a way better slogan. Why aren't you working with the marketing department to get that slogan out?
I got things on deck. I'm trying to do some things. Let's talk after this. Let's see. But I think that's what people really mean, because those images of cops in full ragged, it looked like something out of the Matrix. Like I said, armored personnel carriers, they're using like heat rays and stuff like that. Just crazy off the wall stuff for domestic protests. I think that's what shook people up, and that's where that slogan came from. I think that's a really good thing. But to your point about safety, I think everybody wants safety, and that's an intergenerational that goes across ethnic lines and everything. I think the way that you provide safety is a little bit is different. Is different depending on who you ask. Now, to answer that, I grew up in a time where there was real community policing, and when I mean community policing, it was like I grew up in a sustainable neighborhood where I had a mother, a father, I had extended family, and I had also family that wasn't family, but there was extended family. Like if you were out doing something in the street, the lady down the block would be like, "What are you doing? Go back home." You know what I mean? That sort of thing.
That's back when neighbors can smack a kid in the head and say, "Stop this." Like now that'd be a problem.
Yeah. Like if, like the lady, like if Miss Mary across the street saw you busting the window, she could tear you up, and then she'd tell your mom and you get tore up another time and everything, that sort of thing. That's pretty much gone. That's where real community policing starts, from the community policing itself and looking out for itself. Then you have to have policing, which I am a fan of this. I like the idea. I don't know where it came from, but there was an idea that police had to live in the neighborhoods or be close to the neighborhoods that they police, so they know who they're dealing with. I mean, look, we've all seen these old shows like The Little Rascals and all these shows where like everybody knew the neighborhood cop, and there were some kids who were acting up. They didn't automatically smack them in the head. They could tell them go back home and that sort of thing. I'm not saying, I know that's an idealistic way of looking at it, but I think if you have police who actually know the people who they're policing or who they're trying to protect instead of police, I think that would go a long way towards diffusing a lot of these situations. Now, to your point about, give it to me again, because I got on that train. But
so the second question, I kind of hit you with a 1-2 without giving you a chance to respond. The second one is, what responsibility do the people who've made it, not famous people, just regular successful people, do they have, I don't want to say what responsibility, that presumes your answer. Mm-hmm. Do they have responsibility? And then what could it be? How do they manifest it?
I think they do have a responsibility. And again, I'm going to take the onus off of celebrities, because that's automatically what people gravitate towards, because they're so high visibility and so wealthy. But no, there is absolutely this attitude that once I've made it, then I need to get out of my neighborhood and I need to live as far away from the people who I came from as possible. And unfortunately, sometimes that sort of mentality, I can understand it because sometimes the people who you grew up around won't let you be great. But I think there's always people in every neighborhood. I don't care if it's the worst neighborhood in the worst city in America. There's always somebody, there's always some kid, there's always some people who could benefit from seeing you there. I'm not saying you have to save everybody, but I think it is imperative, especially on African Americans who've been successful, to try to figure out how I can create a pipeline to get people who may have an interest in what I do, or maybe not even have an interest in what I do. Sometimes just the fact that you're there in the neighborhood and they see you can have an effect. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even if you're not doing something, even if you don't have a program or you don't have some sort of organization, just the fact that you're accessible to people and they can see you and you can talk to people and maybe lift people up that way can help. But if you want to do something as far as like creating an organization, create something outside of just doing lip service and something along the things like LeBron is doing and some of the things like Kaepernick is doing that people don't really know about, I think it's important that people who are successful reach back and pull people out who maybe have some potential to do something for themselves. I think that's really how other people do it. I'm pretty sure other people in other ethnic groups do that sort of thing. They just don't talk about it that much because they're not as visible. But I think it's imperative for people who have become successful to reach back and help out their communities. That's one way to get sustainable communities. That's how you create pipelines for people to go into college or create networks if you don't want to go to college. If you have a business idea, to take it to somebody who may be able to fund you or somebody who can give you advice. I think it's very important.
I grew up with zero connections because we came here. I didn't speak English, so my parents didn't speak English. So, you know, we had no network. There was no one to contact, no uncle with some amazing job in the city or whatever. It wasn't in the cards, and I recognized that, and I knew that that was an issue not just for based on color or whatever, but just based on community and background, and so. When I taught junior achievement classes, which, I taught like economics and success skills, and, we ran like little companies inside of these classes. Then I would volunteer like, once a semester, to teach a class, mostly minority students. These are public schools in New York City. And, every time I would come in, I would put my name and my email address on the board and say, look, if you have any questions or if you need some advice or you need some help, reach out to me. And in, I would say, 12, 13 years of doing that, you know how many kids reach out to me?
How many?
One kid. This kid Shatik, great kid. He didn't even need me. He reached out to me, but that's always like the adverse selection problem because he already was like going to a great school. He went, I think he went to Babson, and he was studying accounting. So he was already like, well, he didn't need me. I could call him for advice now. But that's the thing. It's like, even the conditioning to ask for the help isn't there, even when it's being offered. It was so strange to me because I'm like, hey, I'm a guy who works for some successful corporations. I'd been working in financial services. Whatever. You would think at least once some kid would say, hey, I'd like to learn about interning at Amex or something. Nothing. And that bothered me, but more confused me than anything else. So it's almost like you can't rely, because maybe, and I try to understand this phenomenon. Is it because they feel hopeless and that maybe you can't help them, or because they, feel uncomfortable because they're young and you're some old fart who's, coming in and moonlighting and trying to teach them something, or, I don't know what it was. I could never figure it out. And to this day, I don't have a great thesis. And it wasn't for lack of trying to reach out. And certainly I helped them, or I think I taught them really valuable things in those classes. But beyond that, not much success or traction. And I don't know why. And I'm wondering, like, if that's not enough to just provide that sort of like hand up, or just put out a hand, say, hey, this is a connection. Mm-hmm. Nothing. Weird.
I don't know. The answer to that could be as individual as every kid you taught. You never know what somebody's story is. It could be some of that stuff. Some of it could be just like you said, embarrassment, or the fact that there was a generational divide that couldn't either one of you couldn't breach. You never know. You never know what somebody's home life is. You never know what kind of reinforcement they're getting outside of the time that they're spending in a classroom. I don't know. I got no answer. And again, that's something that is a universal thing. There's always going to be this divide between people who may be ashamed to ask for help or may not know how or may not know what to ask for. Sometimes that's part of the problem too. I mean, and that's not just for kids, that's for everybody. Sometimes you got to know what you want and what you really are trying to do before you can even ask for anything. I'm an adult,
Yeah,
and sometimes that happens.
and that was one of the I created my own lesson plans, excuse me. And one of the things I wanted to do is show the diversity of jobs and career paths that are out there and how much they pay. And I wanted to connect the lifestyle they wanted to lead to the careers that they were interested in. So I wanted to match the cost with the income and say, hey, if you're going to go into the arts, that's a much lower earning field. And if you want to have this house and this car and this whatever, then you're going to have to figure out how to adjust and make those two things meet. And it turned out to be a very powerful lesson for a lot of these kids. But like I said, I'm surprised that more people don't do it. I'm surprised they didn't take me up on things. And I wonder, are apprenticeships the thing, or mentoring, or there's probably programs that would work, and I don't see a lot of it, or at least I don't hear a lot about it.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I think there's a lot of different things that could happen to try to encourage kids to take on some of these opportunities or maybe at least be aware of them. Um, I don't know. I think it's just again, I think it's just as individual as the people you're trying to reach. I think try maybe listening is the first step. You know what I mean? If people are willing to talk and willing to give you some insight on what they want and what they're looking for, that might be a way to start moving things. But education isn't really my field on that. Formal education
Yeah.
isn't really my field. But so I can't tell you. All I do is talk to people and just try to give people some information they can use.
Well, let me ask you this just to close things out. Do you have either a prediction or a prescription for the future? So if you see something on the horizon happening that we should be aware of, or you have a suggestion about something that should happen or you'd like to see happen, um, give me one thing.
Uh, I think if I had to make a prediction, I think that technology in all its forms is going to be more important for success or failure of individuals and societies than it's ever been in the past 20, 30 years. And what I mean by that is we have a supercomputer. This is a cliche, but we have supercomputers in our hands. We have the ability to access any information we want. We almost have the ability to access any people we want. And I think there's a wealth of information and there's a wealth of opportunity in these devices and in tech and in trying to make connections, put human interaction in the tech. I think that's going to be the future because we're talking at each other right now. I think we're going to have to start talking to each other. And then I think that's how things are going to go if we're going to make it as a collective.
That's great. And hopefully this is a start and more people like us will engage in this way. And I would like to see the sensible people prevail because I feel like there's a lot of crazy out there.
I'm going to give you this. Have you seen Judas and the Black Messiah?
I don't think so. No.
You should see it. It's a movie about the Black Panther from Chicago named Fred Hampton. Basically, it's kind of like the conversation we had earlier about Malcolm X. People had this idea of what Fred Hampton was because he had the black beret, he had the black militant look and everything, and he was. But there's a very important scene where he walks into this meeting of these white activists called the Young Patriots. They were basically dirt poor Appalachians with Confederate flags and stuff in front of their meeting place. If you looked at it from the outside, it looked like the Klan. But he basically walked in there with the Panthers rolling deep, and he said, "You and I have a lot of the same enemy." And then he went to this group called the Young Lords, which was a bunch of Puerto Rican activists who had some of the same interests. And he said, "A lot of the things we're fighting against we have some of the same interests. And he basically created a coalition. That was the first Rainbow Coalition before Jesse Jackson took it. It was basically people who were on the ground, grassroots people who were saying that we all have a common enemy. We're all dealing with all these same factors. Why don't we put our heads together and try to build something? Just take a look at it.
I'll check it out. That's great. Thank you so much for coming on. Loved having you on, and hopefully we can do this again.
My pleasure, Steve. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, review it on iTunes, and join the Patreon, where I'll have bonus material and many other exclusives.